Yeah, hello. Hey, how's it going, everybody? I am Matt Aubert, as he said. I'm an incident commander with Cisco. Maybe I got the mic too high. My background is in digital forensics and incident response. We're here to talk about server message block worms, right? So, an agenda for this talk, I'll start with an introduction on the subject and what to expect out of the presentation. Then I'm going to give an overview of server message block, the protocol. It's very high level. We're not going to dig apart the protocol and talk all kinds of detail about it. It's just to make sure that everybody's on the same level because people have different varying levels of experience doing incident response. And then I'm actually going to present a scenario in sort of a tabletop exercise format, right? This is actually pulled from tabletop exercises that we do. So there might be some opportunities there for group participation and how you would handle it. And then we'll wrap up the talk, right? Pretty easy stuff. So why are we in this room? We're here to talk about server message block worms and the surprising or unsurprising damage they can do to an enterprise, right? I think a large number of the investigations I've done over the past 12 months have shockingly been from really old commodity SMB type stuff, and failure to install patches, failure to monitor logs, just really simple basic security things. If you've heard me talk previously, or you've seen me do any webcasts, most of them have to do with really run-of-the-mill type things because many of my customers tend to not even install patches on their hosts, or they don't have endpoint security. Right? And some of you might be saying this is old hat. Yeah, it is, but it still keeps working, right? If it works, if it's stupid and it works, then it's not stupid, right? As they say, right? And then I want to make sure that we reinforce about disabling legacy protocols such as SMB1 and decommissioning off or walling off legacy hosts. This is usually a theme of many of my talks is making sure that legacy hosts have extra amounts of security around them to make sure that they don't remain a risk. And remind everyone that patching and system hardening is incredibly important, right? All right, so a little bit about me real quick. I've got a master's degree in digital forensics. That's my primary technical thing that I do. My role as an incident commander is more of a project manager type thing. Some organizations might call it an incident lead or incident coordinator, right? I write reports and I give talks and stuff, right? I got a whole bunch of dopey certs, right? And everybody has different opinions on certifications. I think they're okay. They help you get jobs. They get you through human resources, right? And you can follow me on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn and Medium at AubSec. Prior to joining Cisco, I worked in a couple of Fortune 500 companies doing incident response and digital forensics. I did malware analysis for the United States Marine Corps as a contractor. And I was on active duty in the Marine Corps for about 9 years as a cyber systems chief before I got out and started doing digital forensics. Who here in the room are veterans? We got any veterans in the room? Am I the only one? Okay. What about full-time incident responders? Right. A lot of people do incident response as an ancillary duty, but actual people who do incident response. Right. Yeah. That's awesome. So. All right, now on to what we're actually here to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about server message block. It's a protocol also known as the Common Internet File System. It's used for file sharing, right? I mean, it's when you share a file. That's how, in a Microsoft Windows environment, that's how people access it. And so it's very common in Microsoft Windows, right? And in modern Windows, it runs over 4.4.5. In older versions of Windows, it runs over NetBIOS. So you have NetBIOS ports that are impacted by this. And why is that? Why are the ports important? Because some of my customers have port 4.5 open to the internet on Windows XP hosts that are vulnerable to WannaCry and Eternal Blue, right? The reason that I'm having this talk is because this is most of what I do is related to these stupid SMB worms that people don't bother to patch for or monitor for or filter for at their access control lists. Right? And then how can it be exploited? Vulnerabilities in SMB1 can be used to exploit systems using null credentials, such as, Eternal Blue. We have WannaCry Netya. I just had a WannaCry investigation last week from a hospital in Michigan, right? And then Poorly hardened endpoints are often exploited by worms as well, such as failure to follow least privilege principles. When we get into the scenario portion, we're gonna talk about CACBOT and Nemotet, which leverages simply having the ability to write files to your neighbor's machine, and it spreads laterally that way, right? It's very easy to prevent, but nobody does anything to do it. A number of my customers don't even bother preventing it, right? And then password reuse. And then, they're typically delivered over, I talked a little bit about 445 not being filtered, add access control lists at the perimeter, both inbound and, and both in egress and ingress, right? You need to filter both ways. Nobody should be sharing files with people out to the internet. Nobody from the internet should be accessing your file shares, right? Phishing emails. Right, that's probably the most common way that my customers tend to get is they get an email that makes it through their email filtering system. Somebody opens it and it executes, and then pretty much any other way you can deliver malware, right? And then it spreads laterally over SMB. Once it's on your enterprise, if you're failing to patch your host, it's just going to spread on its own and make life for you very, very difficult, right? All right, so this is where the bulk of the presentation is, and we're going to walk through a tabletop exercise together as a group. Hopefully some people will want to participate and talk about how they would handle these. Hopefully it's a little bit of fun, and not just the incident responders, but anybody who's a security engineer or does something else in security, get a wide range of how you guys would handle an incident. And we're really using CACBOT or an SMB worm as a platform to discuss how incident response works. So, group participation, we're going to have group participation and guided discussion, so I'm going to bring up some topics. Hopefully some people provide some answers. There really aren't any right or wrong answers. I say that, with a big asterisk, there are some wrong answers, right? But that's okay, right? They're all learning experiences. I don't know everything, certainly, and and so sometimes just having simple conversations with people helps go, that's a better way to handle these types of incidents or something that I never thought about before. And we're going to walk through the incident response process together. And the goal is to identify a possible path to recovery. Again, I'm an incident responder, so usually when I'm working, it's already bad, right? So so my assumption is that things are just going to get nasty all the time, right? So just a little overview of the incident response process. This is, I was told I wasn't allowed to use the NIST diagram in our official document, so this is how I got around it, is by using some smart art and PowerPoint, right? But the phases effectively are preparation, detection, analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, and post-incident activity. We're going to focus on detection analysis. We're going to talk about containment and how we can eradicate recovery from SMB worm that spread laterally. And then, talk in general about how maybe you think that your organization could improve their security posture from what really should be a relatively simple thing to prevent. So now the scenario, right? We have a large number of users have started calling the help desk and reporting that their accounts are being locked out. So many that the help desk is overwhelmed. Attempts to unlock accounts are unsuccessful, and they're quickly locked out again after the help desk personnel perform the procedure. Further, some service accounts have started to get locked out as well. Right, so the impact is significant. It's almost immediate, and typically this happens within a couple of hours, and so there's not really much time to react to it. And so your best method is usually prevention and not having to worry about it afterwards, right? So in your organization, think about this, right? What criteria do you have for declaring a security incident? Do you have a policy in place that says that we have a security incident? This is what the incident responders are authorized to do. These are the people who are in charge during a security incident. And then who's responsible for making that decision, right? Somebody has to be, in a RACI chart, has to be actually responsible for activating the incident response plan and engaging the incident response team, whoever that may be. Some organizations have centralized group of incident responders that are always incident responders, and others stand up the incident response team per engagement from various security, business units and stuff, or maybe the network engineers send a guy, and the Active Directory people send a guy to help engage in incident response. Do you have the ability to do digital forensics, which many organizations don't have a digital forensics capability or malware analysis capability? And then do you have a retainer with somebody who can help support that? So regarding this specific situation, what actions can you do to identify the source of this activity? We have a bunch of locked out accounts. How would we figure out who's locking these accounts out, right? This is an Active Directory situation, right? How many hosts are impacted? What host was the first one to lock out? What's the impact to the business currently? And what could be the impact in the future if we don't get this fixed quickly, right? So who has an idea of what might be a source, a logging source or some sort of source where we can figure out where these lockout events are occurring from, right? Because we have to identify the original. Yes?
A SIM.
A SIM?
Probably based on Instagram or any other pie chart, something like that, where to find some SEO traffic to the source code.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other ideas? What would be a real simple one? Unfortunately, a lot of our customers don't have a SIM, or if they do, it doesn't have logs in it, right? Yeah.
There's a ton of traffic, but you can try to look on the DCs.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good one. I can tell you what we did in this case is that's where we went. We went to the DCs and looked at the security logs for the domain controllers and identified what the earliest known event, failed login event for an Active Directory credential was, and that's how we identified the original host. But there's all, because the customer wasn't centralizing any of their logs, they had no SIM. What's really interesting is some customers will have a SIM, and the only thing that'll be in there will be their endpoint security appliance, and that's the only thing that's in there. Well, you already have a dashboard for that. So now you're paying for a SIM, and the only thing you're pumping in there is stuff that has its own dashboard anyways. But that's a separate thing. Yeah. Right, so this is pretty straightforward, right? We go to the domain controllers, we get the logs, we do some really basic log analysis, and we identify that a number of workstations and a number of user accounts are being impacted, all related to failed authentication attempts. And all the workstations happen to be in the same network segment, right? So we kind of start to narrow down what might be occurring here. Right. So now that we know that they're all in the same network segment, how would that influence our investigation? What would be the next step? Right, this is maybe a little too easy, and people probably, Yeah, absolutely. Maybe it's too early to contain, right? You don't know enough about it. It's really depends on what your SOP is and how you handle it. Some organizations do, right? They'll contain it right away because they don't really have an SOP. They don't necessarily have a good digital forensic background. They think it's easier to contain it. It's not necessarily wrong. Right? And the problem with containing too early is that if you have some sort of advanced interactive threat actor and now you contain that network segment, they are aware of what you're doing now. You've just made they know you're onto them, and they're going to start performing other actions. I tend to take the middle ground road on that, right? The reality is you got to get the business up and running. And more often than not, it isn't actually an advanced threat actor. It's just some commodity malware ruining your day, right? So what I would say the next step for me is, so we know what network segment it is, but we don't necessarily know what the individual host is that originally started it for various reasons. Maybe you have multiple domain controllers and the logs aren't aggregated, or the logs are rolling over, and you weren't necessarily able to identify what the original host is. So what I would do is I would go and find the earliest known host based on the domain controller logs that was impacted by the event, and begin doing forensic analysis on that, which is relatively straightforward, right? We're just going to grab the security logs from that host and look at authentication events that occurred on that host. By the way, this is all real-world stuff. This is actually a log that I pulled from an investigation, but I obviously changed Bob and Alice from whatever was identifying it, right? So we have authentication logs from Workstation Alice contains type 3 logins that start at 210159. That's all UTC, not that it matters. Similar events were identified on other workstations in the same subnet. The earliest known of these events were sourced from WS Bob 01 from the account Bob. In addition to the successful login of Bob, failed login attempts from other accounts were identified. So the failed login attempts is what's causing the lockouts, right? And that's how we identified that there was an incident occurring. System administrators have concluded that this activity should not be expected, as in Bob should not be logging into Alice continuously. And if you look at the timestamps, this is all within the same second. So he's attempting to log into a workstation continuously in the same second. That's not an individual doing that. That's some sort of code doing that, right? And the system administrators confirm that's not expected. And the reason I put that down there is because some people will say, well, maybe it's supposed to do that. And it's like, no, it's not supposed to do that, right? That's not supposed to happen. Who knows what a type 3 login is, by the way, right? Like, so why would that? Yeah, it's a remote interactive, to be honest, I don't even remember. So, yeah, it's just a remote login from one machine to another, right? So it's one machine logging into another machine. That really shouldn't be expected on workstations. How many people share files between workstations in their enterprise on a regular basis? Is that activity that should be occurring, right? That should almost never be occurring. You should be sharing files with a file server so that way they can be backed up as part of your backup procedures, right? Your disaster recovery procedures. So would it make sense to block workstations from ever communicating laterally with each other over SMB, not being able to do this at all, right? 2 workstations should not talk to each other over 445. They should talk to file servers. They should talk to domain controllers, right? And so we can very easily implement controls to prevent this from ever occurring. All right, so, so a little bit of discussion. How many other hosts are also compromised? We're not going to have that answer in this talk, but, realistically, I would treat the entire subnet, or the entire network segment, as being potentially compromised, right? And what would be the plan for scoping the rest of this incident, and what indicators could we use to identify hosts that are in scope? We talked about type 3 logins. To other workstations, that might be a good way to scope the incident, is to get a hold of workstation logs and review for type 3 logins. Do we know what the initial infection vector is? Have we figured that out yet? Do we know how we got this? Any ideas? Any guesses? All right. And so we did forensic analysis on WS-ATLAS-01. We identified login events were occurring from WS-BOB-01. We should probably do forensic analysis on Bob's workstation too. Yeah, how many organizations in here, or how many people represent organizations that actually have, the ability to be able to do digital forensics internally? It's good stuff, right? Yeah, I think they come in handy, right? Having a digital forensics guy around to be able to rip apart an image. Not that it's hard, but a lot of organizations, incident response teams are more like security operations centers plus. They're not necessarily full-time incident response people who know how to handle digital forensics properly, right? So we do forensic analysis on workstation Bob, and we see that at just before 21:01:59, at 20:55:53, a randomly named directory containing an executable is created. Additionally, it is confirmed that Bob received an email from an external source with a suspicious PDF attachment at 20:22:33. Somebody did a little analysis real quick on that PDF, and it downloads an executable from nothingtoworryabouthere.com/1145862.exe, right? That seems a little suspicious. By the way, this is the actual email from the incident. What had happened in this situation was they had really good security on their main enterprise. This was a hospital, and they received this email. The email was blocked. Or the attachment was blocked from opening, and so they forwarded it to one of their friends in the research network, and the research network had almost no security whatsoever on it, and they opened this up and blew up the entire research network in a couple of minutes here, right? It ended up being a pretty nasty situation. So, what would be the failure in people, processes, or technology that would have occurred to allow the delivery to be successful, right? What failed to allow this to happen? Anyone want to comment on it?
Email filtering.
Email filtering, yeah, that's a big one.
User education.
Yeah, exactly, user education, right? Not only in this situation, not only did they receive the attachment, but after it didn't open and it was blocked by their endpoint security tool, which for some reason didn't delete it, but it didn't allow them to open it. They forwarded it to a colleague in a less secure network where they opened it and were able to really cause some serious damage to their enterprise for a while. And then what would be the next steps, or what should be the next steps in this investigation, right? So we have the PDF, we know it goes and downloads an executable. We still haven't necessarily identified what the executable is, right? And
Might other people receive the email only?
yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's exactly right. You got to go and find the email and make sure that nobody else has it in their inbox. Because that's the worst thing that happens is when you're in the middle of an investigation and you're starting to move to recovery, and somebody forgot to EX merge the email, and then it happens again, right? And then that's always fun. So, you know, as any good incident responder should do, we took the executable that it downloads and we, you know, did some malware analysis. This is just from ThreatGrid. I'm a big fan. If it shows up as commodity malware, I stop there and I don't do any more analysis on it because I figured out what it is supposed to do anyway. Some people like to take some time digging it apart, right? And so we figured out that it's CACBot, which, to be honest, at this point, I would have expected that to be the case. And then, you know, forensic analysts have concluded with high confidence that the failed login attempts are related to lateral movement from W32 CACBot, right? So we know it's CACBot. We've suspected it's CACBot, and now we know what's going on here, right? So within your enterprise, what would be the risk of did we really talk about what CACBot does yet? We'll talk about that here in a second here. So what would be the risk to your enterprise if you have an SMB worm spreading all over the place, locking out accounts, right? Who here doesn't think that would cause significant impacts to their enterprise, right? And then, you know, what application of people, processes, and technology can be used to minimize this incident? Any comments on that? What can we do to stop this incident from spreading now, right?
User education.
Yeah, well, what's that? Yeah. Well, if we disable it outright, right, that might cause some problems, right? Because 445 is used for file sharing in general, right? So, well, I guess you're right. If you blocked it inbound. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The clients don't need to receive 445 because the session is started on an ephemeral port on the client side, right? So it doesn't really matter. You could disable 445 on the clients. One of the things that I've done is establish access control lists in order to prevent lateral movement like that, or use a tool like NetFlow monitoring tool to monitor 445 traffic over in the workstation subnet, right? All right. So, and then we also have to start thinking about continued scoping and containment. We talked about containment earlier in the investigation. Typically, I would wait a little bit later to start containment. What's that threshold that you guys feel comfortable when you start to contain an incident as an incident responder, right? When do you roll into containment? Anybody got an opinion on that? Because people got strong opinions on that usually. Right. Yeah. So my take is generally once we know roughly what the incident is, and we feel that it is a commodity sort of incident, and I don't suspect that there's any additional advanced threat situation going on, then I usually typically will go ahead and recommend containment. And a little bit of a discussion about what CACBot does too, and why it's a big deal. CACBot spreads by collecting credentials from the workstation that it executes on and spreading laterally over SMB. This process can result in locked out accounts if CACBot can enumerate the user account but not the password. So what it'll do is it'll collect user accounts and attempt to log in, but it doesn't have a password, and it causes account lockouts. CACBot is actually a key logger. It specifically is supposed to exfiltrate banking credentials, but I can tell you from experience that some of my customers have experienced not necessarily specific banking related incidents. So one of my customers had their Verizon account credentials stolen from them during a CACBot, and was used to buy millions of dollars worth of cell phone equipment and sent to New Jersey. They weren't in New Jersey, and so that was a pretty big red flag that something was up. And then, so lastly here, what's the next step in the incident response process? I already kind of hinted at that, right? We're going to probably move to containment unless we have some sort of other reason. So we believe it's been fully scoped in one network segment. What are some actions that we can prevent it from spreading? We isolate the infected host from the rest of the business, right? And we do that by containing the network segment. So this is this one right here. I'm a DoD guy, and I think that if a host has malware on it, you should reimage it. That's my take, right? And some people have different opinions that you can clean them. I don't think you can ever clean a host, especially after something like this happens. There are credentials being stolen. You're betting when you clean a host, you're betting on your incident responders being knowledgeable enough to fully understand the scope of the incident. And I've been doing this for a little bit, and I don't ever trust that I 100% know what happened, right? There are always a lot of unknowns. Hopefully we can minimize the number of unknowns, but sometimes there are more unknowns than knowns. A lot of that has to do with poor logging and poor security hygiene. And then we also need to reset user credentials, right? Because CACBot is a worm that steals user credentials. So we need to make sure that we reset them. And not only user credentials in Active Directory or in the services that our organizations actually maintain and operate, but also in our we may also want to recommend that our users reset their banking passwords, which is a whole another thing, right? Because now you have to get your legal team involved to see whether it's okay to tell people that you had a worm outbreak. But I think it's ethical to tell the people that work in your enterprise that their banking credentials might have been stolen, and that it would be unethical to not tell them. I don't know what other people's opinions are on that, right? Who here wouldn't tell people that they had that they had an outbreak, right? Is there anybody here who wouldn't? I'm just curious, right? I've had customers do that where they say we don't want to tell anybody about it. I was like, well, they haven't been able to get on their systems, right? Or when you have a ransomware attack, they're like, oh, don't tell anybody we got ransomware. It's like, well, they can see it on their workstation. It says, send me Bitcoin, right? Why would you not tell them that they have a ransomware attack? That's kind of ridiculous, but so how can we eradicate the compromise from the enterprise? Right? This is actually considerably complicated, right? If this worm has managed to spread and impact an entire network segment, eradication is not as straightforward as simply re-imaging hosts. What else should we be doing during this eradication process, right? Any ideas?
Disable SMB1.
Absolutely disable SMB1. SMB1 actually wasn't involved in this, but you should be disabling SMB1 and hardening your endpoints while you put them back on. A lot of times too, our customers will have an endpoint security tool, but we'll have it disabled to the point that it's useless, or will maybe they're really behind on patching, or their logging's really bad. All these things. An incident like this is an opportunity. Or as they say, never waste a good crisis, right? Take this opportunity to provide better hardening to your endpoints, to provide better logging systems, so on and so forth, right? I think one of my customers had an issue with, again, it was an SMB worm, and they used it as an opportunity to throw out their poorly managed endpoint security tool that was managed by the desktop team, and implement a new service that was actually managed by the security team, so that way they didn't have to worry about the desktop team disabling everything, right? So, and then what I was actually really getting at here, eradication and recovery from this incident, one of the big things too is while you're re-imaging hosts, who here in their organization can re-image 1,000 hosts simultaneously in a day, right? And probably not too many. As some of you work in small or medium-sized companies might have to manually do these re-imagings, right? Or do them in small batches where you're going and re-imaging 5 or 6 hosts at a time. If you have to, in this situation, there was, I think, a couple thousand hosts that had CACBot running on them in the same network segment. It was really bad. So how do you re-image 2,000 hosts, right? It's kind of difficult. And then you also have to think about, as you're re-imaging them and putting them back on the network, what's the probability of them getting CACBot again, right? Because there are other infected hosts. Even if you've improved your endpoint security, you've installed a better endpoint security tool, maybe it is blocking CACBot from executing, but the other infected hosts are continuously trying to send it to that host, right? And so it's generating log events, it's confusing what's going on, it muddies the water while you're trying to move towards recovery, right? Some obvious short-term recovery options. Some organizations need to get certain business functions operating quickly, and they don't have time to wait for a long, drawn-out recovery phase, right? So maybe those specific business units have some hosts that are put onto another network segment quickly to allow them to operate. I had, one customer was allowing them to access the internet over what is it, like MiFi cards, right, on these same infected hosts. And that's not a good recommendation, by the way, right? Because these hosts had CACbot on them, and now they were no longer protected by any of the enterprise security tools that we were working on deploying. And long-term recovery options, we already kind of talked about this. How do we prevent it? Maybe we stop for, disable 445 on workstations, so workstations can't be contacted over 445 anymore. We have to make sure that our patching is actually occurring and isn't, that we don't accept the business unit's excuses that we can't patch because it's going to break things. I think we can show them that sometimes not patching does break things. In this case, we used CACbot in this scenario, but if it was WannaCry and you had SMB1 enabled because you had some printer that still needed SMB1 for users to print to, which is usually the excuse I get, and maybe the answer is, well, they should be printing to a print server, and that print server can have SMB1 enabled on it, right? So that way you limit the number of hosts that actually have SMB1 enabled. And then we should always end an incident with some post-incident activity, like what are some steps and tasks that should be completed following an incident? Who does lessons learned activities following an incident, right? Absolutely. There's not much value in spending the amount of time working on investigating an incident if you're just going to let it happen again the next time, right? So that's where lessons learned come in. You need to understand whether your incident response team did their processes well, whether the tools functioned as they were supposed to function. Maybe this guy that opened that attachment or forwarded it has a habit of doing that, and this is the 8th time he's done this exact same thing, right? Maybe somebody from human resources needs to sit down and talk to him and have a conversation about about corporate policies. I've never seen that happen, right? That's a kind of a pipe dream there, but I would like to think that at some point somebody's going to get in trouble for continuously forwarding malware internally, right? And then I keep bringing this up because it's important. What are the changes to people, processes, and technology that can be made as a result of this incident, right? The people is hopefully that guy gets fired, right? The process is maybe the reality is often when we come into these investigations is this incident, happened maybe the day before, or 2 days prior, or it's been brewing for a while. And there just isn't really good, maybe there's good logging in place, but nobody's bothering to watch the log. So we don't have a good continuous monitoring process that needs to, maybe that needs to be corrected there. Technology, it's usually just patching. People aren't installing patches. They're not installing endpoint security tools. And, even using the basic ones that are installed in Windows, they'll disable that and then also not install anything else afterwards, right? Just all bad. So how can we prevent this from happening? Install patches, decommission old operating systems where possible. We talked a little bit about SMB1. Where it's not possible, we recommend, my recommendation is usually to put that legacy system behind a walled garden, right? It's in its own little space. It can do whatever it wants in there, but nobody can talk to them, right? You can only talk to them on the ports that are necessary. This is usually a big deal in hospitals where they have a bunch of Windows XP and Windows 2000 hosts floating around for medical devices. Your ventilator is running on Windows XP and is vulnerable to SMB1, and it's just sitting there keeping you alive. Hopefully nobody exploits it. And they're usually also Wi-Fi enabled and on the same Wi-Fi network that the guest Wi-Fi is on, right? That happens surprisingly often. And then also hardened endpoints, right? I'm a big fan of STIGs. I know some people hate them because they're a pain in the butt, and sometimes they do break things because they're usually a little more strict than the Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit. The one thing nice about STIGs is you can go to iase.disa.mil and you can get STIGs for things that aren't Microsoft technologies and figure out how to harden them, right? And then if you want to go the easy route, right, this Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit is a great tool to help quickly deploy some basic security compliance across the enterprise. I always recommend, every single incident I ever do, I recommend lapse, even if it has nothing to do with the incident, because you should be randomizing your local admin account passwords, because a lot of these types of SMB worms take advantage of shared or reused passwords across administrator accounts, so I can just jump from one host to the next using the same credential. And then also multi-factor authentication. I have a background in doing public key infrastructure, so I always want to make sure that people remember multi-factor authentication is an option, and it solves a lot of problems usually, as long as it's enforced, right? Now, network security, you should have a default deny any on both ingress and egress, right? Only stuff outbound should be established sessions and things that you have explicitly approved and have established a risk profile for, and you know that this is an acceptable port to receive or send traffic on. And force endpoints through a proxy and deny use of external DNS. This is just a general one, right? A lot of companies spend a lot of money on their proxy servers and their DNS security, but then they have no access control list or nothing that prevents users from just going and doing their own thing, right? And then, so what's the point in spending all that money if you're not going to bother to force them to use it? And a lot of malware comes in and it'll just go ahead and try to use 8.8.8.8 for its resolution, because they know that you're probably going to block the malware, right? The malicious domain lookup, right? All this stuff is really basic stuff that unfortunately a lot of organizations don't do. I mean, you don't have to say who you work for, but how many organizations how many people in here work for an organization that probably isn't doing some of this, right? I mean, who can say that that's the case, right? As security people, it's frustrating, right? We want them to block, default deny any on ingress or egress. I was working in investigation for a ministry at a foreign country, right? It was in the Middle East, and very important ministry, and they had a default deny or a default allow any as the first rule in all their firewalls, and not surprisingly, they got blasted, right? And then they only had one security guy, and they already started re-imaging their domain controllers before we showed up. And I was like, well, you just re-imaged everything. There's nothing to see. And they didn't save anything. It was just bad. It was a bad situation. They apparently didn't care, right? So, yeah. Anyways, and then continuous monitoring, right? A lot of organizations fail on this one. You buy the most expensive Blinky boxes in the world. They do these amazing things. They have these amazing heuristic engines in them, and then you don't bother to look at them, right? And you don't have somebody looking at them continuously. They go, oh, well, it's this guy's job once a week to go in there and check the logs and see what's in there. That guy's never doing that, right? Let's be realistic. Whenever I hear that during any sort of proactive thing, my first thought is that guy has never looked at these logs. He's probably got 1,000 other things he's doing. Looking at the logs is last on his list. And, that's where outsourcing comes in, right? I mean, if you're on the internet 24/7, as everybody is, if you have an organization that, unless you unplug the connection from your ISP as everybody leaves the door at 5 p.m., you need to make sure somebody's watching your logs 24/7. And that's where, outsourcing it to a cheap MSSP to look at those logs in the off hours comes in handy, right? So, all right, let's start wrapping up here. So this is just a little bit of stuff about us, right? I got to plug it. My company's paying for me to be here, so I got to make sure I mention them. You can look up our blogs at blogs.cisco.com/security. And then, to be honest, the Talos one has a little more research stuff that might be a little more interesting. My blogs are usually about reminding people to patch. That's not really exciting work. But Talos' security blog is really awesome. And then if you do have an incident and you don't have an incident response team, I want to make sure that you know how to get in contact with us, so that way, we can find somebody to help you do the investigation. Right, and you can contact us using that email or calling that phone number, and somebody will be willing to help you out. And then I'm going to be at Cisco Live this year. Anybody going to Cisco Live? Anybody in here? No? So I'm not going to talk about it anymore then, right? If you do feel like going, it's in Orlando this year. I'm bringing my whole family, so we're going to Disney World and stuff, right? right? And this is just some of the references and resources I talked about earlier, right? I actually didn't talk about MS-17 010. I'm actually doing an investigation currently that involves that being exploited. It was a hospital again. They had a HVAC system running Windows XP with WannaCry already on it when it got brought into the enterprise, and then and then they had a bunch of Windows XP hosts that were used for patient monitoring. And so when the HVAC system came online, because of course you have your HVAC system and your your patient care systems on the same network, right? There's absolutely no segmentation between them. WannaCry just jumped right over to it and just started blasting those boxes. So it was fun. It was very easy remediation, right? It was like, well, patch those Windows XP hosts, right? And they had to get a hold of the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, and get that patched, right? So I don't have anything else. Right? That's the end of my talk. I hope it wasn't too boring. If you want to talk to me afterwards, by the way, we're hiring. So I know that the last guy said that too. So if you want to get a hold of, you want to talk to me about working on the Cisco Security Incident Response Service, feel free to chat with me afterwards. They're all work from home jobs, which is really cool. What's that? Except when I have to be on site. That is correct, yes. I actually don't go on site that often, though. So we're surprising how little we actually go on site. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question for you. So it seems obviously there are a lot of companies that do, but a lot of other companies don't have a full incident response team. It's just the security team jumps into it.
Exactly.
So you don't have a full-time focus on it. Is there any good tools for forensics or anything that we can use?
Yeah, so one of my favorite tools for doing forensics that's free, I'm just a big fan of Plazo, right, and doing timeline analysis through Plazo. It's absolutely great. I'm a huge fan of it. It does this really great job of identifying the source of the log source. It's just really great, right? I just absolutely love it. And unfortunately, I don't. It takes a little bit to run through an entire image, but if you carve out some stuff, Xways is a really great forensic tool too. It's very cheap. So if you want to say get into forensics and you don't want to spend a whole lot of money, Xways is an amazing forensic tool to do that. While it's still a full-featured GUI-based forensic tool, and then there's always the sleuth kit, right? Right. All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
You were talking about your detection analysis phase, and particularly when you find commodity malware.
Yeah.
Is there a specific number of pieces of evidence that you will look for before you will sort of walk away and feel contented or confident that it's commodity malware, or is there a tool or what? Well,
to be honest, if there's, so my take on it is if I throw it in, because we use ThreatGrid because it's a Cisco product, or VirusTotal or whatever, and there's signatures for it, and there are a lot of signatures for it, and it's very clearly that's what that is, and I can get 3 or 4 samples from different hosts and they're all the same thing, then I'm going to take it as commodity and I'm going to move forward with it. You're never 100% confident. There could be something else. One of the things I took out for time, but there was we had another customer who had a very similar incident where it's CACBot, and I was like, oh, this is just CACBot again, right? And we get into it and we notice we deploy AMP for Endpoints, which is Cisco's endpoint security tool. And AMP for Endpoints, we have it deployed everywhere. We have it deployed on the domain controllers. AMP for Endpoints notices that PowerShell executes a base 64 encoded string. AMP for Endpoints does this really cool thing now where it decodes the base 64 for you. It very obviously was PowerShell Empire. It just said that's what it was, right? And so it was, so we told the customers like, hey, you got this CACBot thing. Yeah, that's frustrating, but you got PowerShell Empire running on your domain controllers right now. Somebody is logging into your hosts, and they didn't care. So that was I went through this whole, song and dance about how big of a deal this is and how, your whole domain is compromised and they've gotten everything now. And they were like, whatever. And they just they didn't care. They never did anything with it. So I was like, that was ended up being a big deal because they didn't want to pay for our service either afterwards, even though we deployed AMP for free and, identified a bunch of stuff. They didn't think that was of any value to them because they didn't believe that domain controller compromises were a big deal. So it was a bit of a nightmare. That was actually, the adversary got onto that box because the lady that works the lobby had domain admin rights because she needed to make people accounts, and her box got owned because she was doing what a lady in the lobby does all day and surfs the internet, and her box got owned, and then it pivoted onto the domain controller and then just destroyed the domain controller, and it was a very fun incident there. So that really is like 99% of the incidents that we investigate.